There's a particular kind of silence that lives inside Buckingham Palace. Not the silence of an empty room, not the silence of a library or a chapel, something older than both of those. Something that has weight to it, like the air itself has been holding its breath for 200 years and never once let go. I know that silence. I've walked those corridors, and I can tell you when that silence breaks, you feel it in your chest before you hear anything at all. My name is Thomas Alderton. I served as a senior household steward for the royal household for 11 years. I was not a famous man. I was not a decorated officer or a titled gentleman. I was the man who made sure the silver was polished before a state dinner, who checked that the fresh flowers arrived on time for ceremonial mornings, who walked the long carpeted corridors so often I knew every creak in every floorboard by name. I left service in 2024, but this story, the one I'm about to tell you, happened in the spring of 2023, about 7 months after Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II had passed. About 4 months after His Majesty, King Charles III had begun the slow, enormous task of reshaping what it meant to live inside that palace without the woman who had defined it for 70 years. And it happened because of a wardrobe. Not just any wardrobe. A wardrobe in Camilla's suite, the Queen Consort's private apartments, that had been closed, locked, and overlooked during the long chaos of transition that follows any death, but especially one of that magnitude. You have to understand what those months were like. The September passing had sent the entire household into a kind of controlled frenzy. Every room, every corridor, every closet and cupboard and private space had to be inventoried. Personal items catalogued, official items preserved. The line between what belonged to the crown and what belonged to the woman who had worn the crown, that line had to be drawn carefully, document by document, room by room. It was enormous work, quiet work. The kind of work that happens behind closed doors, while the world outside watches the funeral procession and reads the tributes in the newspapers. And in the middle of all of that, things got missed. Not through carelessness. I want to be clear about that. Through sheer volume. Through the impossible logistics of cataloging a life that had touched every corner of a palace, every royal residence from Balmoral to Windsor, every ceremonial space in the United Kingdom. One wardrobe in one suite, in one wing of Buckingham Palace, it fell through the cracks. And when it was finally opened, 7 months later, what was inside it changed something in all of us who were there. That particular Tuesday morning started the way all Tuesday mornings did in those early months of the new reign. I arrived at the household staff entrance at 6:45. The sky over London was doing that thing it does in March, pretending to consider sunshine before changing its mind at the last moment. The light was thin and gray and watery, the kind of light that makes even the gold of the palace gates look slightly apologetic. There were 2 foot guards posted at the side entrance. I knew one of them not personally, not by name, but by face. A young man couldn't have been older than 23 with that particular posture they all develop after enough hours of ceremonial training. Straight back, still eyes. A stillness that looks like stone from a distance, but up close if you watch carefully you can see it's more like water. Contained, moving imperceptibly, alive. He didn't acknowledge me as I passed. He wasn't supposed to. But I noticed that morning, for some reason I couldn't quite name, that his jaw was set a little tighter than usual. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was the cold. I went inside. The corridors of the palace that early in the morning have a quality I've always found difficult to explain to people who haven't experienced it. The public rooms are like museums, grand, formal, designed to impress. But the working corridors, the staff passages, the parts of the building that tourists never see, those feel different. They feel like the interior of something living, something vast and ancient and still very much breathing. I went directly to the household coordinator's office on the 2nd floor. Mrs. Patricia Hume, who had been coordinating royal household operations for longer than I'd been alive, was already at her desk when I arrived. She was in her mid-60s, small and precise, with silver hair cut close and eyes that missed nothing. In 11 years, I had never once seen her rattled. That morning, she was close to it. Not visibly. Someone who didn't know her wouldn't have noticed. But I'd watched that woman manage a state banquet for 47 heads of government with a burst pipe in the kitchen and a floor of broken glass, and she'd been calmer than she looked right now. She looked up when I came in. "Thomas," she didn't say good morning. That told me something. "I need you to assist with a cataloging task this morning." Wing C, second floor, Queen Consort's residential suite. I sat down across from her. Which room? The dressing room adjacent to the east bedroom. She paused, just a fraction of a second. The wardrobe B unit, the locked one. I waited. We've been unable to locate the key since September, she said. Facilities finally sourced a duplicate from the estate records this morning. The official inventory of Her Majesty's, of Queen Elizabeth's, personal effects is incomplete without it. Another pause. We have reason to believe some items may have been moved during the transition. We're not certain what's inside. Who else will be present? Yourself, Lieutenant Hargreaves from the guard detail, and myself. She folded her hands on the desk. This is an internal matter. Quietly handled. That phrase, quietly handled, was as close as Mrs. Hume ever got to saying, I don't know what we're going to find, and I'd rather not have an audience when we find it. The Queen Consort's suite in the east wing of Buckingham Palace is not what most people imagine when they picture royal apartments. It is not a fantasy. It is not gilt edges and velvet ropes and chandeliers throwing light on marble floors. Not in the private quarters. In the private quarters, it is something much stranger, much more intimate. It is, above everything else, a home that happens to exist inside a palace, that happens to carry the weight of centuries, but a home nonetheless. The kind of space where a real woman returns at the end of a long public day and becomes, for a few hours, simply herself. The east corridor leading to the suite had 3 guards posted at intervals that morning. That was slightly unusual. Standard rotation would typically have 2 in that section. But this was the early transition period, and His Majesty's protection detail had increased ceremonial presence throughout most of the residential wings while the new security protocols were being settled. Lieutenant Hargreaves met us at the entrance to the suite. I didn't know him well. He was career military, formerly of the Household Cavalry, seconded to the guard detail about 3 years prior. A compact, serious man in his late 30s, with the kind of face that doesn't give much away. Dark eyes. A small scar along the left side of his jaw that I'd always assumed came from somewhere he didn't particularly want to discuss. He had the duplicate key and a sealed estate envelope. He held it the way you'd hold something breakable. Mrs. Hume nodded at him. Shall we? It wasn't a question. The dressing room was at the end of a short private corridor, beyond a sitting room that faced east and caught the thin morning light through tall curtains that had been partially drawn. The room smelled the way old rooms in old buildings often smell, of wood polish, and something faintly floral that might have been perfume or might have been the ghost of perfume, the scent memory of a fragrance that had once occupied the air so consistently it had soaked into the walls. There were 4 wardrobes along the north wall. 3 of them had been catalogued in the autumn. The 4th, wardrobe B, as Mrs. Hume called it, the one nearest the window, was set slightly apart from the others. It was older than the rest, much older. The wood was darker, with a grain that seemed almost to move when the morning light shifted. There was no visible lock on the outside, just a small brass fixture on the right door that required a specific key fitted from the back. We stood in front of it for a moment. None of us spoke. I'm not entirely sure what we were each thinking. I know what I was thinking, though I didn't say it out loud. I was thinking about the months since September, about the woman who had owned this room, this wing, this life, and the woman who had inherited it, about the gap between those 2 things and how vast and complicated and full of unspoken weight that gap actually was. Lieutenant Hargreaves broke the silence. Right, he said, quietly, almost to himself. He opened the envelope and took out the key. It was smaller than I expected. Old brass, slightly irregular in shape, the kind of key made in an age before standardization. He turned it in his fingers once, just once, and then stepped forward to the wardrobe. The lock released with a sound that seemed too loud for the room. He stepped back. Mrs. Hume reached out and opened the right door. The left door followed, slower, swinging open on its own from the slight imbalance of the hinge. And then silence again, but a different kind. Not the palace silence I described before, something else. Something that pushed against the chest from the inside rather than the outside. Because we could see what was inside. And none of us had expected it. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. Not because it was hidden, not because it was damaged or covered or wrapped in anything. It was completely visible, hanging exactly as if someone had placed it there with the utmost care, with the intention that it would be found exactly this way, exactly when the time was right. But the mind does a particular thing when it encounters something that context says is impossible. It stalls. It loops. It insists on re-examining what the eyes are clearly seeing because surely there has been a mistake. There was no mistake. Hanging at the center of wardrobe B, occupying the full length of the rail with the kind of presence that makes everything else in a room feel smaller, was the Coronation Robe. Not a replica, not an archival garment from some earlier reign stored and forgotten. The Coronation Robe, Queen Elizabeth II's. The one she had worn on June 2nd, 1953, in Westminster Abbey, before the watching eyes of 27 million people in Britain and countless more around the world. The crimson velvet parliamentary robe, 21 feet of it, lined with Canadian ermine, trimmed in gold lace, as unmistakable as any object in the modern history of England. It was hanging in Camilla's wardrobe. Mrs. Hume made a sound I'd never heard her make before. It wasn't a gasp exactly. More like the sharp intake of breath a person makes when they step off a curb they didn't see coming. A sound of sudden recalibration. Lieutenant Hargreaves had gone very still. His hand, which had been resting against the open door of the wardrobe, dropped slowly to his side. He didn't say anything. I stepped forward one step. As if pulled. The robe was extraordinary. Even here in this quiet room in the gray morning light, even separated from the pageantry and the abbey and the weight of a coronation day, it was extraordinary. The velvet was so deep a red it was almost burgundy in shadow, almost orange where the light caught its nap. The ermine was cream and spotted, impossibly soft-looking, cascading along the hem and the front edges in a river of white. The gold trim along the borders was still bright, still intricate. As if it had been brushed and maintained just recently. And perhaps it had been. That was the thing that struck me then, standing there in that dressing room with Mrs. Hume and Lieutenant Hargreaves. It didn't look like something that had been put away and forgotten. It looked like something that had been tended. The velvet had not gathered the dust you'd expect from 7 months in a sealed wardrobe. The ermine wasn't compressed or flattened. The gold trim was free of tarnish. Someone had been caring for it. And that meant someone had been inside this wardrobe. Someone who had a key we didn't know existed. Someone who had been visiting this garment in private, regularly, or at least recently. I looked at Mrs. Hume. She was reading the same evidence I was reading. I could see it in her face. The slow, precise recalibration happening behind her eyes. "We need to document this," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. "Lieutenant, could you—" Yes, he was already reaching for his radio. Then he stopped. He looked at the robe, then at Mrs. Hume. "Should I call it informally, or—" "Call it in to me," she said. "To this room, no broadcast, not yet." He nodded and stepped out into the corridor to use his radio privately. I turned back to the wardrobe. There were other items inside. I should say that clearly the robe was not the only thing hanging there, but the other items were rendered almost invisible by the presence of the robe itself. The mind simply kept returning to it, the way the eye keeps returning to the brightest point in a painting. There were 3 other garments, long and formal, covered in protective cloth bags, that I would later learn were gowns from Elizabeth's personal wardrobe that had not yet been transferred to the royal collection. There was a flat cedar-lined drawer at the bottom of the wardrobe that contained several pairs of white ceremonial gloves, folded with the precision of someone who understood how fragile these things were. And on the shelf above the hanging rail there was a small, flat leather case, dark green, aged at the edges, closed with a simple brass clasp. I didn't touch the case, I didn't open it. That wasn't my place. But I noted it the way you note something that carries a significance you can't yet name. Mrs. Hume had moved to stand beside me. She was looking at the same things I was looking at. "It was moved here deliberately," I said. I didn't say it as a question. "Yes," she said, not surprised that I'd said it. "The robe was transferred from Windsor after the funeral. It was signed into the estate inventory." A pause, "but not signed out to a specific location." "And the key?" She didn't answer that immediately. She was still looking at the robe. "There are certain things in this household," she said finally, "that are managed with a quietness that doesn't always make it into the official paperwork." She paused again. "This may be one of those things." I understood what she meant. I think most people who have worked closely with the royal household for any length of time understand what she meant. There is the formal record, meticulous and documented and available to future historians. And then there is the lived reality, the human decisions made in grief, in love, in the small private hours that no ceremony accounts for. The things that don't have a protocol, because no protocol can fully anticipate the private weight of being human. Something had happened here in these 7 months, something quiet and personal, and the evidence of it was hanging in front of us in 21 feet of crimson velvet. Lieutenant Hargreaves came back from the corridor. "Mrs. Hume," he said, just her name. She turned. He held her gaze for a moment. "His Majesty has been informed." She closed her eyes briefly, just a fraction of a second, then opened them. "And he's asked that nothing be moved until he arrives." The room went quiet again. "He's coming here," I said. I wasn't entirely sure why I said it out loud. It wasn't a question either. It was more like the mind needing to hear the reality spoken. "He is," said Hargreaves. "Approximately 40 minutes." Mrs. Hume nodded once. The small, precise nod of a woman reorganizing priorities in real time. "Thomas," she said, "I need you to close those corridor doors and stand at the east entrance. No household staff enters this wing until I give word. Can you do that?" "Yes, of course." Discreetly, no explanations. If anyone asks, we're conducting a scheduled inventory. I went to do as she asked. But as I turned to leave the room, I looked back at the wardrobe, at the robe. And I'll tell you, I've thought about this moment many times since, tried to identify exactly what it was I felt in those few seconds before I left the room. It wasn't awe, though there was some of that. It wasn't discomfort, though there was a little of that too. It was something more like witnessing. The feeling of being present for something that you know, even as it's happening, you will spend the rest of your life trying to adequately describe. The feeling of standing at the edge of a private grief, much larger than your own. Of glimpsing, for just a moment, the vast interior of something that the world can see the exterior of, but will never fully understand. I left the room and closed the door behind me. The 40 minutes felt both very long and very short. The east corridor of the residential wing is not a public space. There are no tourists, no guided groups, no casual visitors. The people who walk that corridor are the people who have specific business being there, household staff, protection officers, the occasional footman or domestic. And that morning, one by one, they came to the entrance and received the same quiet information. No access until further notice. Scheduled inventory. Nobody pushed back. People in this environment learn early that certain moments call for a particular kind of cooperative blindness. You accept the stated reason. You go about your business. You understand, without being told, that the reason given is not always the complete reason. The thin gray March morning had been brightening slowly outside, and by the time I heard the sound of quiet footsteps on the carpet at the far end of the corridor, the light through the east windows had shifted to something closer to pale gold. Still not warm, still carrying that particular London March quality of almost spring, but brighter. He came with a small group. His private secretary, a quiet man named Barrows who I knew only by sight. One protection officer, whom I will not name and wouldn't describe in detail even if I did know more. And a woman I recognized from the correspondence office whose presence surprised me slightly. A detail I've always remembered without quite understanding its significance. King Charles III walked the corridor the way he walks most spaces. Unhurriedly, with a quality of attention to his surroundings that I'd noticed on the few occasions I'd been in close proximity to him over the years. He wasn't the tallest man in the room when he entered a room, but he had a way of being present in a room that had nothing to do with height, a quality of concentration, of being, more genuinely perhaps than many people ever manage, actually there. He acknowledged me at the corridor entrance with a small nod, nothing more. I stepped aside. He went into the wing. I couldn't hear what was said inside the dressing room. Not clearly. The corridor doors muffled most of it, and what filtered through was too fragmentary to follow Mrs. Hume's precise voice, the quieter, lower register of His Majesty's, a long silence, then another exchange. But I could hear at one point a quality in that silence that was different from the others. Longer, heavier, the kind of silence that has a sound of its own if you've learned to listen for it. And then nothing for some time. I've been asked in the years since, Whether I think I understood in that moment what was happening inside that room. Whether I grasped what the king was experiencing when he walked in and saw his mother's coronation robe hanging in his wife's wardrobe. I've always answered the same way. No, not fully, not completely. Because grief of that order, the grief of a son for a mother who was also a monarch, who was also a symbol, who was also an institution, who was also just a woman he had known all his life, that kind of grief doesn't translate into the imagination of someone who hasn't lived it. You can observe its edges. You can witness the way it shapes a person's face for just a moment when they think no one's watching. But the interior of it, that's sealed to everyone else. What I can tell you is what I know, and what I later understood. The coronation robe had been moved. Not misplaced, not lost in the chaos of transition, moved deliberately with care. And the small green leather case on the shelf, the one I hadn't opened, I later learned what was inside it, not from official channels. From a conversation, quiet and private, that I had with Mrs. Hume about 6 weeks after that morning. Inside the case were 12 photographs. Not official portraits, not ceremonial images, personal photographs. The kind taken on a family occasion, informal, unceremonious, the kind of image that captures a person in an unguarded moment. They were photographs of Elizabeth and Camilla together, from various occasions across the later years of the Queen's life. A garden somewhere that looked like Balmoral, a reception small and private, a moment at what appeared to be a family lunch, sunlight on a table, someone else's hand visible at the edge of the frame. And in one photograph, the one Mrs. Hume described most carefully when she told me about this, Camilla was seated beside Elizabeth, and they were both laughing at something outside the frame. Not the performative laughter of a public occasion. The real thing. The kind that creases the eyes and loosens the whole face and makes a person, for that second, entirely themselves. Someone had placed those photographs there, in the same wardrobe as the robe, in the same case as if they belonged together. As if they were meant to be found together. I thought about all of this standing in that corridor. I thought about Camilla. The public narrative of her life, the contested early years, the decades of complicated public perception, the long road toward acceptance. I'm not going to rehearse all of that here. Everyone knows the broad outline. But what I thought about that morning was something different, something more specific. I thought about what it must mean to step into a role that someone else had defined for 70 years. To come into a palace, into rooms and corridors and wardrobes and all the private spaces that still carried the presence of a woman whose absence filled every corner. And to find, in the middle of all of that, something left for you. Not left by protocol, not left by the estate inventory or the Lord Chamberlain's office or any official process, left by the woman herself. Or by someone acting on her wishes. Or perhaps, and this is what I've always suspected, though I have no proof, left by Camilla herself, in a gesture of private devotion that she never intended anyone to find. Because here is the other possibility, and this is the one I keep coming back to. The wardrobe was in Camilla's suite, her dressing room, her space. What if she had moved the robe there herself, not in the chaotic aftermath of September, before, during the long transition of the final years when Elizabeth's health was declining and everyone who loved her was beginning quietly to prepare? What if it had been moved there, to that particular wardrobe in that particular wing, as an act of closeness, of keeping something near that could not be kept near any other way? And the photographs alongside it, evidence of a friendship, a real one, whatever the public thought of it, that had grown quietly over years in the spaces the public never got to see. I don't know if that's what happened. I genuinely don't. I'm a steward, not a historian, and not a mind reader. But it's what I think happened. The king was inside the suite for approximately 25 minutes. When he came back out into the corridor, he was accompanied only by his private secretary. The protection officer had remained at the suite entrance. He walked the corridor slowly, with that same quality of attention I'd noticed before, but now there was something else layered underneath it. Something that sat in the set of his shoulders and the slight distance in his eyes. Not devastation. Not collapse, something much more contained than that. He passed me at the corridor entrance. He stopped. I wasn't expecting it. I straightened. He looked at me for a moment, just a moment. "Thank you," he said. It was quiet, simple. I'm not sure even now exactly what he was thanking me for. Perhaps for maintaining the corridor. Perhaps for the general concept of service, offered on behalf of everyone in the household who had navigated those months of transition with the same quiet discretion. Perhaps it was simply something that needed to be said in that moment, and I happened to be the person closest. "Of course, Your Majesty," I said. He nodded and continued down the corridor. I stood and watched him go. "I need to tell you something about coronation robes. About what they actually are, beyond the pageantry and the ceremony and the television images that most people carry in their memories. A coronation robe is not simply a garment. It is not in any meaningful sense even primarily a garment. It is an argument, a statement about continuity, a physical embodiment of the idea that there is something larger than any single person, larger than any single life, that persists through time and transitions and deaths and successions and all the turbulence of history. Every monarch who wears it is, for those hours, the latest point in a line that stretches back through centuries. They are themselves, and they are also everyone who came before them. They carry the weight of it literally. 21 feet of velvet and ermine is not a light thing, and they carry the weight of it in every other sense too. When Elizabeth wore it on June 2nd, 1953, she was 25 years old. 25, younger than most people reading this, younger than most of the men and women serving in her household at the time, and she walked into Westminster Abbey and allowed that weight, all of it, to be placed upon her, and she carried it without visible faltering for 70 years. After the coronation, the robe was preserved with extraordinary care. It lived, for most of its existence, in the royal collection. Stored with archival precision, maintained by specialists, brought out for specific occasions, and then returned to its controlled environment. But in the final years of the reign, exactly when and why, I don't have the precise details, it was moved. Out of the formal collection storage, to Windsor. And then, at some point in the complex autumn of 2022, it ended up in a wardrobe in the east wing of Buckingham Palace. In Camilla's wardrobe. I want to dwell on that for a moment, because I think it gets lost in the broader story if you let it pass too quickly. Camilla, the woman who, let's be honest about the history, spent years as the most publicly disapproved of figure in the British royal family, whose name, for a period in the 1990s, was spoken in certain quarters with a contempt that had all the warmth of a door slamming shut, who navigated the impossible complexity of being loved by a man who was also a prince, whose marriage had failed, whose first wife had become the most photographed woman in the world, and whose grief, when it came, had briefly focused the world's anger somewhere it needed a target. She walked that road for years, quietly mostly, without the instinctive charisma for public affection that Diana had possessed, without the skill or perhaps the temperament for the kind of performance that turns public opinion. She simply continued, showed up, did the work. Stood beside Charles at hundreds of engagements, year after year, and allowed time to do what time eventually does. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, Elizabeth had decided something. I don't know exactly when. I don't know whether it was a formal decision made in conversation with advisors, or something that settled quietly in the Queen's own mind over the years of observing Camilla at close range. But by the final chapter of the reign, it was clear, to those of us inside the household, to anyone paying attention to the subtle signals the palace sends when it wants to communicate something without actually saying it, that the relationship between Elizabeth and Camilla had become something genuinely warm. Not performed warmth. Not the professional courtesy of two women sharing a family, the real thing. The photographs in the green leather case were evidence of it. A laughing face in a garden, a hand passing something across a table, two women of different generations finding, somehow, a shared language. The robe in the wardrobe was evidence of it. And something about that, about this object of extraordinary symbolic weight having found its way, through whatever combination of intention and circumstance, into the most private space of this particular woman felt, to me, like an act of passing, like the gesture of someone who knew what she was doing, who had thought carefully about what it means to hand something on. I've talked to a few people over the years about what I'm going to describe next. Most of them have reacted with some version of the same thing, a long quiet and then a slow nod. Because what happened in the weeks after we opened that wardrobe was not what I might have expected. There was no press release, no announcement, no choreographed reveal designed to generate a particular narrative in the newspapers. Nothing left that room in a way that was designed for public consumption. What happened instead was careful, quiet procedure, the kind the household does very well and very discreetly. The robe was assessed by the Royal Collection specialists, documented properly, placed into the formal catalog with its accurate current location on record. The other garments in the wardrobe were processed similarly. The green case and its contents went somewhere I don't have official knowledge of. I suspect, though I can't verify, that they went to His Majesty's private keeping. Some things are not for the archive. Some things are for the people they belong to. And the wardrobe itself was left in the dressing room. Just left, clean and empty now except for the absence of what had hung there. Lieutenant Hargreaves, who I spoke to briefly in the corridor a few days after, said something that I've never forgotten. "You know what struck me," he said. We were waiting for the morning briefing to begin. He was looking at nothing in particular at the wall at a point somewhere beyond it. "It didn't smell like storage, the robe, when they opened the doors." He paused. "It smelled like it was being worn." I knew what he meant, not literally. But there's a quality that garments acquire when they're regularly aired, regularly tended, kept in an environment of warmth and care. They hold a presence. They carry the residue of being loved. The robe smelled like that, like something that had not been forgotten. Mrs. Hume told me, in that conversation 6 weeks later, that she had spoken privately with one of the Queen Consort's ladies-in-waiting. She didn't give me the name. She wouldn't. But she relayed something that this woman had shared, again, quietly, privately, with the discretion that the household runs on. Camilla had known the robe was there. Of course she had. It was her wardrobe. But there was more to it than that. According to this account, unverifiable, personal, exactly the kind of thing that will never appear in any official record, Camilla had, on more than one occasion in the months since September, gone into that dressing room alone. Not to use it. Not for anything practical. Just to be with it. To stand in front of that open wardrobe with the crimson velvet and the ermine and the gold trim in the quiet of a private morning or a long evening and simply be present with it, with the weight of what it represented, with the loss, with the passage, with all the complexity of inheriting a role from a woman who had defined it for longer than most people's living memory. With the love, perhaps, whatever form that took between them. When I heard this, I thought about the corridor, about the morning, about standing at the east entrance while the king was inside, about the particular quality of the silence I'd heard through those closed doors. I thought about what it means to grieve something that you cannot fully express in public, about the private rooms we build inside ourselves for the losses that are too complicated for the world's simpler narratives. And I thought about that 21 feet of crimson velvet, hanging in a closed and locked wardrobe in a wing of Buckingham Palace, tended and present and quietly kept. Not forgotten, never forgotten. Just privately held. There's a thing that happens when you've worked inside an institution like the royal household long enough. You stop seeing it the way the outside world sees it. The ceremony, the formality, the magnificent distance of it, all of that fades into the background and becomes simply the texture of ordinary days. The gold becomes wallpaper. The guards become colleagues. The queen was a woman who preferred her dogs near the fire on cold mornings and had opinions about tea that most people would find surprisingly precise. You see the human interior of it, the real architecture, not the marble and the gilt, but the relationships, the loyalties, the long-standing currents of affection and tension and history that run through any family, however extraordinary the family's context might be. When you see it that way, when you've been inside it long enough to see it that way, stories like this one acquire a different quality. They stop being stories about royalty and start being stories about people, about the things we hold on to when we lose someone, about the spaces we create to hold our grief when the public space for it has its own demands and its own limitations. I left royal household service about a year after the morning I've described. Nothing dramatic. It was simply time. 11 years is a long run, and I had things I wanted to do that required existing outside those corridors. But I've thought about that morning more than I've thought about almost anything else from my time there. Not because of the robe itself, though the robe was extraordinary. Because of the feeling that lingered in that room. The sense of something that had been arranged, not bureaucratically, not officially, but humanly, across the gap between two people. Between the woman who had worn the crown and the woman who would come after her. Between the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. I want to talk about Lieutenant Hargreaves for a moment, because he's part of this story in a way that I've understated in the earlier sections, and I want to correct that. Hargreaves, in the days after we opened that wardrobe, was responsible for resecuring the entire East Wing during the period before the Royal Collection specialists arrived. This was not a small task. It required coordinating guard rotations, managing access with a discretion that left no trace of the unusual activity, and ensuring that what had been discovered remained, for the time being, exactly as contained as Mrs. Hume needed it to be. He did this with the kind of professional thoroughness that I'd come to associate with the best of the guard staff. No drama, no deviation, clean, precise, reliable. But there was one moment, in the second day of that period, that I witnessed and that I've thought about often. He was at the end of the East Corridor, late afternoon. Most of the household staff had cleared that wing for the day, and the light was low and amber, the kind of late winter afternoon light that makes everything look slightly warmer than it is. He was standing at the closed door of the dressing room, just standing there. Not guarding it in any formal sense, his posture wasn't the ceremonial stillness of a formal post. He was just standing, looking at the door. His arms were at his sides, his face was very still. I don't know how long he'd been standing there before I noticed him. I came around the corner from the corridor junction, and simply, there he was. He heard me, he turned. The professional mask went back on immediately, clean and complete. He nodded, I nodded. Neither of us said anything. I walked past him and continued to the stairwell. But I thought about it. I've thought about it many times. Because here is a man, career military, trained in the particular discipline of not showing, of being present without being felt, of serving as a kind of structural element in the architecture of the institution. And for a moment, when he thought no one could see him, he was simply a person standing at the door of a room that had held something remarkable, processing it in whatever way he had available to him. The uniform doesn't stop you being human. It just means you have to find different moments for it. I've been told, by people whose access to these matters is better than mine, that the Coronation Robe was eventually returned to formal archival storage in the Royal Collection. Properly catalogued, in the right controlled conditions, accessible to historians and curators under the standard protocols. I've also been told, though I cannot confirm this and would not describe it as verified, that Queen Camilla requested, in the period after the coronation of King Charles III in May 2023, that the photographs from the green leather case be duplicated. That copies were made and placed in a particular private album in her personal apartments. I think about that. The idea of those photographs, a laughing afternoon in a garden, a hand across a table, two women finding each other in the private margins of public lives, living on in an album somewhere in the palace, being turned to occasionally in quiet moments. Being remembered. There is an image I keep in my own memory, which I'll never be able to show anyone because it exists only in the unreliable archive of a person's mind. The morning light in that dressing room, the crimson of the robe, the particular quality of silence when three people stood in front of an open wardrobe and understood all at once that they were looking at something that was not supposed to be witnessed, not because it was secret, but because it was private. It belonged to two women. One of them was gone. The other was 3 floors away, beginning a day that would include another formal engagement, another public appearance, another performance of dignity and composure for a world that had not, even then, fully decided how it felt about her. And in the quiet of that wardrobe, the robe waited, red as a heartbeat, still as everything that persists after the person is gone. There was a moment near the end of my service that I've never really told anyone about. About 3 months after the morning with the wardrobe, I was doing a late corridor check in the East Wing, not a regular duty, just a coverage arrangement for a colleague who'd taken ill. It was late, not the dead of the night, but past most of the household's working hours. The palace had settled into its evening quiet, which is a particular quality of stillness all its own. I passed the Queen Consort's dressing room. The door was ajar. Not open, not wide. Just slightly, the kind of not quite closed that happens when a latch doesn't quite catch. The kind that lets a sliver of light and a sliver of warmth into a corridor. I should have checked it, pulled it properly shut, and noted it in the log. But I stopped, because I could hear very faintly through that sliver of open door movement, the very quiet sound of someone in the room, not alarming movement, not hurried or furtive, slow, deliberate, the kind of movement that belongs to someone who is exactly where they have chosen to be. I stood in the corridor. I did not open the door wider. I did not knock, I did not log it, I did not continue toward it. I stood for perhaps 30 seconds. And then I walked on down the corridor. I made my rounds. I went home. I've never told anyone what I thought I heard through that door. I've never speculated about it publicly. I'm not going to do so now. Some things are not mine to interpret. Some things belong to the people who were in that room, in whatever way they were in it, for whatever private reason had brought them there. I was a steward. My job was to make sure the rooms were in order, the corridors were secure, and the household ran as it was meant to run. The private lives that moved through those corridors, the grief and the love and the long human interior of the place, those were not my material. But I carry them, the way you carry the things you've witnessed when witnessing was all you had to offer. There is a quality to certain discoveries, the unexpected ones, the ones that arrive not with drama but with quiet inevitability, that reshapes the person who makes them. Not dramatically, not all at once, more like the way water reshapes stone, gradually, over years of returning to the moment, of sitting with it. I am not the same person I was before I stood in that dressing room on that gray March morning. I can't fully account for the difference. I can't map it precisely or explain it in terms that would satisfy a careful examiner. But when I think about what it means to serve something larger than yourself, when I think about what it means to be one person in a long chain of people, each holding their small portion of a larger weight, I think about that morning. I think about the robe, about 21 feet of crimson velvet, preserved and tended and privately kept, in a locked wardrobe in a woman's dressing room, at the end of a corridor guarded by a young soldier with a tight jaw and still eyes. About the king who walked that corridor with the quality of a man, carrying something interior that the exterior would never entirely reveal. About the photographs in a green leather case, a garden, a table, a laugh that was real. About the particular silence that lives inside a palace that has held a century of sorrows and kept them all, with extraordinary discipline, almost entirely to itself. Lieutenant Hargreaves retired from the guard detail in 2025. I heard this through a mutual acquaintance in the household. He took a position in a security consultancy. Private sector, very quiet life, apparently. Mrs. Patricia Hume continues to serve the royal household, as far as I know. She would, of course. That woman will be at her desk on the last day of the world, making sure the silver is polished. And Camilla, Queen Camilla, as she is now properly addressed, continues to be exactly who she has always been. Publicly, imperfectly, humanly, carrying the weight of a role that was never designed for her and that she has, slowly and without particular fanfare, made her own. I watch her sometimes when there's a ceremonial occasion on the television. I look at her face during the moments when the cameras catch her off guard, when she doesn't know she's being filmed, or when the guard drops just for a second before it goes back up. And I think about a dressing room in the East Wing, about a wardrobe, about a key that turned in a lock and a door that swung open on a gray March morning, revealing something crimson and still and quietly preserved. About two women. About the things we keep close to us when we can no longer keep the person. They opened the wardrobe looking for an inventory item. What they found was a love letter written in velvet and ermine, from a queen to the woman who would carry her name forward into a world she'd already left.